The third kind of category of shrubs is what I call the tree-like shrubs. And I call them tree-like not because they're big, because some of them aren't, but because they have a woodier branch structure. It's not soft like a choicea. And each branch divides many times, like a tree's branches. It divides and into smaller and finer branches. That's a characteristic of a tree. Something like a cane grower looks more like a feather with a main stem and side bits. And that would be your nandina and your forsythia and other plants in the cane grower category. But trees and tree-like shrubs have a stiffer branch structure and it's more intricate. And this makes them a higher class of plants than the others. We sort of know that a witch hazel beats a forsythia, but we're not sure why. And the reason is they have a better branch structure. Trees and tree-like shrubs have a much smaller pruning budget. You want to pull way back in the amount of foliage that you take off to maybe a 16th or an eighth of the foliage, generally speaking. Examples of tree-like shrubs would be things like rhododendrons, camellias, witch hazels, pieruses, thread cypress. Anyway, these are the tree-like shrubs. And instead of making large reduction cuts like you would on a nandina, you want to stick pretty much to thinning or removal cuts. And whatever you do, don't top your tree. Topping your tree is bad and wrong. It shouldn't be done 99% of the time. Sometimes people top their trees to improve their view, and what your neighbors see is a butchered tree with water in the background. Plus, you get that water sprout rebound effect. And so it doesn't really even work to get you your water view. When you top a conifer, you get fewer water sprouts, but a very bizarre thing happens. The next two lowest limbs grow out and up, and you get what I call the flying wedge. So size reduction on trees and tree-like shrubs is discouraged because it ruins that beautiful branch structure. You might get water sprouts, and it's also very hard on their health. This is the sort of pruning that you would be doing on a tree or a tree-like shrub. You mainly do it to make it look more open and airy and delicate. You don't actually need to prune these shrubs or trees either. I guess in the perfect world, people would go in and take the dead wood out of their trees and tree-like shrubs, and all their shrubs for that matter, and the plants would feel better. Not that I talk to plants. I'm not saying I talk to plants because that would make me a crazy person. But it does make them healthier and does make them look better. If you want to improve the looks of your plants and your tree-like shrubs, you take off the true suckers. Those are the straight-up ugly shoots that come off of the trunk or the root stock. That's true suckers as opposed to water sprouts. Water sprouts are the straight-up skinny, ugly, fast-growing shoots that come from above on the crown, usually from a place where you have over-pruned. And those ones you have to leave because if you take them off, they keep coming back. And you leave them so that they turn back into branches. That's a bit of an aside. Back to how to prune your tree-like shrub. You want to take off the branches that are actually touching the ground or hanging down into foot traffic. You want to take branches that head back through the center, Mr. Wrong Way. To make trees and tree-like shrubs look better, you also take off parallel branches. If you look to the right, you'll see two branches that are doing the same work. It often looks better to take out one, usually the lower one. If you have three in a row that are parallel, you take out the center one if to do so does not exceed the pruning budget. You also look for crossing rubbing branches. Crossing and rubbing, people always imply that damage is happening to your plant, and I think maybe it is, but the reason we're usually taking out crossing rubbing branches is it makes us feel better, more so than the plant. Crossing and rubbing is what's driving you nuts about your shrub or tree. It ruins the good looks of them. So it's really more for us than for the plant. And you do want to take out a few, certainly not all the crossing rubbing branches. And then you also want to separate layers. If you're trying to make your Japanese maple or your pine or your witch hazel or whatever you got look better, you want to locate the various layers of scaffolds. And if you see a branch coming from one of the scaffolds that sticks up too far in the layer above, it can make your shrub or tree look better to cut that out. And you will notice on this illustration that we are also cutting off the top. This would be on a shrub, not a tree. Generally on trees, we let them get to be as tall as they want, because to try to restrain them, you just get a broader, messed up tree. Exceptions would be apples and pears, of course. But if you have a shrub and it's just a little too big, you might be able to get about 10% size reduction by cutting to a side branch that is big enough. Whenever possible, you avoid this and see if you can get what you want just by thinning and taking off lower branches. Pruning tree-like shrubs is the most complex and sort of the artistic part of pruning. So with real trees, you can do general thinning. That's the picture on the left, and it just makes things look more delicate, doesn't reduce the size. You can do crown raising, or also called skirting or limbing up, where you take off a few lower branches. Can sometimes make you feel a little bit less like Big Bird is sitting on your house. And occasionally you can do something called windowing or layering that will make your tree look less oppressive and maybe add to your view. But not all trees lend themselves to this. Only some of them do. And this can be applied to most of your shrubs as well. An exception would be the camellia, which is definitely in the tree-like category, but it takes an incredible amount of pruning, including various forms of heading and lots of thinning, and you can really hammer on them quite severely and you won't get into trouble, which is why it's in the category of easy plants to prune. So a camellia has a huge pruning budget. You can take off up to a third of the foliage. You can skirt it up, make it into like a little tree, which is really what it is. You can thin it out so that it is less oppressive. They can even be espalier. That's when you prune something flat against a wall. And you can cut them to the ground and start them over. Radical renovation is even okay. So this is a picture of a perfectly wonderful camellia that is pretty much neglected down in the industrial area. And it's the nicest thing for blocks around. It's been skirted up a little bit, which I think makes it look pretty cute. And it's covered in pink blossoms and nobody does anything to it. And it's great. Here's another Japanese Camellia japonica. And this one we had to train around that little gazebo business there. So we want to keep it off of the glass top and off of the woodwork. And you can do so using removal cuts, heading cuts, whatever you need to do. You can just prune your camellia to go into any shape that you want it. You can have it go down the side of the house. You can have it go up. You can have it go over. Great candidates for thinning into the shape that you like. This is the problem with Japanese Camellia japonica, is that the blossoms fall off as a whole. Instead of the blossom shattering into different petals and falling to the ground, it turns this kind of apple core orange, sometimes actually staying on the tree and looking unattractive, and also falls down and makes a great big blanket of smush underneath the plant. And for that reason, some people don't like them. I'm more and more inclined just to ignore the flaws of plants and appreciate them when they do something nice and ignore them when they're doing something I don't like. But there's another kind of a camellia called a Winter-sasanqua. That's a winter camellia, and it has a lot looser habit. It's more sort of flowing and not so stiff. And it's so flowing, in fact, that some people train them flat against walls, and they actually specialize in ones that are floppy that you can tie onto a trellis. And that's pretty cool. I actually like them freestanding because they look more natural than their Japonica counterparts, in which case I go look for a sasanqua that's relatively stiff. But you can also find them tied on trellises, take it home, plant it in a little skinny space, and espalier it like this one is. And it blooms in the winter. Some bloom in November, some December, some January, some February. And the flowers do not hang on and turn apple core orange. What they do is they shatter and fall off, and so you don't have that ugly period. They also can smell sweet, and so this is a great thing to have out by your garbage can. When you're taking your garbage out in the middle of winter, you will be suddenly cheered up by the sweet-smelling, spring-looking shrub. I like the camellias because they are so malleable. If you need a plant that gets pretty big, but you can really prune on heavily to fit some required space, I think camellias do a pretty good job. Like everything else, people are always pruning them the wrong way, by which I mean shearing. Oh, here's some kettle drums. This is the classic mal-pruned camellia, just not very attractive. And you can see if it's done at the wrong time of year, you even eliminate the flowers where you most want them, up on the top. The nice thing about selective pruning, which is what we're talking about here, real pruning, is that it doesn't matter when you prune. You will always have flowers. I actually like to prune camellias when they're in bloom, thinning them out, because I can use the cut branches to put in a bucket and leave on the front doorstep for the lady of the house, so she can come home and find something that looks like a flower arrangement. And it really, at some point, ceases to please when you shear things. I don't see that this is an improvement, so don't do that. So with camellias and several other plants, if you're going to thin them out, you start at the bottom and work from the bottom up and the inside out. There's an old saying, you can tell when your camellia is done when you can stand up inside it. Seems to be true. You take off the branches that are touching the ground first. You can take them clear back to the trunk so that you can crawl in there and see what you're doing. And then as you look up, you'll see a bunch of dead twigs and things. You use your hand pruner and your lopper and your handsaw to cut those out slowly and methodically. And this will work to get you adjusted to your plant until you can start seeing wrong branches. In general, you want to prune to open up the center. You can see number 2 says take out a few of the worst crossing rubbing branches, but it doesn't even have to be crossing and rubbing. It can just be something on the inside, clogging up the inside of your plant. And then you can see what it looks like when it's gone. And then 3, you should take out some of the smaller branches on the outside of your plant. And the finished product looks like the finished camellia branch. And this is not light thinning, this is heavy thinning. And in general, you don't want to prune this heavy on most of your tree-like shrubs, but with camellias, it's okay, because I told you it has a really big pruning budget, which means it won't water sprout back and look like heck. There is some artistry involved. While you're in there, you want to make sure that you don't strip it out, inadvertently take off all the internal branches. You want to take some and leave some so that it is equally thin throughout. I was at a consultation with a lady walking around her yard. We went around to the backyard, and there was this ghastly over-thinned camellia with just little few leaves at the end of every branch. And she said that her husband had been to a pruning workshop where the teacher said, thin it so that a bird can fly through. And she told him, when he was through with the camellia, that his teacher was talking about a sparrow, not a goose. So while you're inside, you kind of get the pruning fever, and you have to constantly crawl back out and walk around and ask yourself, have I done too much, and is it time for me to move to another section? If you take out all the crossing, rubbing, wrong way branches of this or any other plant, you have over pruned. So spend your pruning budget wisely and keep moving. Don't make one little corner perfect, because then you will have spent your entire pruning budget in the lower right-hand corner and you won't be able to prune on anything else. So do keep moving and getting back out and blurring your eyes and saying, is this side done? Should I move to the other side? And here's a picture of a nicely sort of thinned up and thinned out camellia. You don't need to prune your camellia for it to look good, but if it's right outside the front door and next to the walkway and it's just too dang much, know that you can go inside. They have a lovely branch structure which you can expose with some thinning and deadwooding. There are other tree-like shrubs that take a similar amount of heavy thinning, have lovely branch structures, and you can take out the deadwood and actually push pretty far before you get into trouble. And that would be Pieris, thread cypress, Arbutus unido, that's a strawberry bush, and a yews. Unfortunately, unlike your rhododendron or your azalea, your camellia is not a good transplant candidate. I have actually transplanted large camellias and had that be okay, but also many of them go into shock and die or just plain look brown and horrible for many, many years. So unlike those plants, you're pretty much stuck with your camellia wherever it is planted. You can, however, do the old radical renovation by sawing it to 2 inches to 6 inches above the ground and regrowing the whole thing. This is especially useful if it has been sheared for 30 years and you want to get it back into its natural shape. I worked at another lady's yard, and near her front porch she had 3 giant camellias, and we thinned them out, and that seemed to work okay for a while, but it really got to be too much. So we actually took them one at a time and cut them to the ground and regrew them. They will grow back pretty fast because they are attached to the root system of a full-size plant. And here again, occasionally one dies. So you must enter into this project cautiously and not ill-advisedly, but only after all other possibilities have been explored, the easiest one of which is to learn to love big camellias. I had another situation where a client of mine had a sheared shrub under her window, and we couldn't even tell what it was because, of course, it never bloomed. We've spent many hours rehabilitating it, thinning it out so that it looked more natural, and it actually started to bloom again. It turned out to be a Sasanqua camellia, a winter camellia. But it also kept getting up over the window, so we cut it to the ground, and you can see the size of the cuts. And in the next year or two, it actually grew back up and looked pretty good. The nice thing about your camellia is that it's evergreen, so you can't see that the new branches are very straight, which is to say not attractive, and you don't see those heading cuts either. It will regrow rather quickly, and it won't have the same beautiful internal structure that a never touched one has. But this just can be a useful thing to know how to do should you need to do it. Of course, you have to have customer buy-off. If you do something like this, you can't just cut somebody's camellia to the ground and expect them to enjoy it. They need to be mentally prepared.